Okay, let's turn now to our political roundtable with CBS News Director of Surveys Sarah Dutton. She's in New York. And CBS Evening News Senior Producer Ward Sloane. He's here in Washington with me. Thanks to both of you. Sarah, let me start with you. We just talked an awful lot there about spending and debt. And one of the questions involved, one of the polls involved the federal deficit. What are people saying about the deficit?
Well, Americans have always been very concerned whenever the federal government runs deficits. Now is certainly no exception. 70% of Americans think it's a very serious problem for the country. About 2 out of 3 think that this are very concerned that this could cause hardships for future generations in the form of unemployment or problems with government programs like Social Security or the health care system. So there's certainly a great deal of widespread concern about the deficit. And in fact, a majority told us that we need to take immediate action on the deficit. Far fewer, just about 4 in 10, say that we can wait until the economy gets better to deal with the deficit. So I do think the poll reflects some urgency.
Predictably, the Republicans, or the people that were in line with the Republicans, said we need to act more quickly than the people in line with the Democrats, right?
That's true. Certainly, Republicans and even independents seem to feel a greater sense of urgency about dealing with the deficit than Democrats do. The problem, of course, is when you try to come up with specific solutions or proposals for dealing with it. That's when it gets tricky, certainly for the American public. There's a lot of support for cutting government programs and for cutting government spending as opposed to raising taxes. But in our poll, when we asked about specifics, specific cuts to programs like Social Security or Medicare, that's when it really gets difficult. And Americans think, well, maybe we should start raising taxes or reducing benefits or, making changes to the highest income Americans. So that's when it gets much more complex.
So, Ward, 56% of everybody questioned said, yeah, we need to take immediate action. Doesn't that kind of play towards what the Republicans are saying?
Well, it does, excepting that, and maybe Sarah can help me out here, but the deficit in terms of things people care about, it drops off significantly from jobs. And so that's one of the trade-offs that, I think when you ask people separately, do you care about the deficit? Yes, of course they do. But where does it fall in terms of what people really care about? It falls way below the line.
So what does Congress do with this? They see these numbers. Obviously, the real message here is the public's not very happy with the way we're operating.
No, and you know what? There's no good answer for either side here because, when in the same poll we found that 62% of the people want to cut spending and nobody wants to raise taxes. And as Sarah was saying, they just don't want to cut spending on programs that affect me. And that's primarily in this country, Social Security and Medicare. And if it doesn't affect you personally, it probably affects your parents or your grandparents. And people do not want to go there. So now we have people saying, well, let's cut it from the military because they have no connection there. And that's easier said than done. And the Republicans, as we just heard the congressman say, have taken the military off the table.
Sarah, real quickly on this point before we move on to health care, what's the trend in terms of how worried people are about the deficit? Is this something that's rising in consciousness?
Well, obviously in early 2000 when we didn't have the deficit to worry about it, it wasn't on the radar screen, but it's been pretty stable. We've been polling about it for the last year or so. On the level of concern about it's been fairly stable. But as I said, this really wasn't an issue 10 years ago. So it is fairly recent in that sense.
But Sarah, when people went to the polls last November, where did they rate the deficit on issues of concern to them in affecting their vote?
Ward, you bring up a really good point, which is that health care and certainly the deficit pale in comparison to Americans' priorities when it comes to the economy and jobs. And that's been the case for years at this point. Since late 2008, the economy and jobs have dominated every other issue by a very large margin. Our polls have pretty consistently found that about half of Americans rate the economy and jobs as the most important problem facing the country, and only about 1 in 10 name health care or the budget deficit or other issues as the most important problem. There's an enormous gap in terms of the percentage who choose the economy and jobs or any other issue as the top priority. And so the deficit, health care certainly fall far behind those topics.
Sarah, while you were talking there, we actually threw up a slide of the health care numbers. Let's take a look at that again, since you mentioned health care. Only 40% of the people in our survey now say we should repeal it right away. The Republicans have made this kind of job one in the opening weeks of the Congress. So what do these numbers tell us about what the public thinks about that point?
Well, as you said, more Americans now want to keep the health care reform bill as it is than want to repeal it. That's a slight shift from what we saw at the end of last year. Opinion was a little more mixed then, a little more evenly divided. We'll see if this is a long-term trend or this is just something that a blip on the radar screen. We'll see if that number that wants to keep it as it is keeps growing or not. I think it's too soon to say. But certainly we did see a slight change from the end of last year.
Ward, it's interesting that the Obama administration, almost every day they tell us it's all about jobs, it's all about jobs. They've kind of gotten the message. This is where the election will be decided in 2 years. Republicans, though, first out of the gate, they're attacking health care because they promised to do that.
Well, that's right, and it's kind of surprising to me that that's where they headed. But, you know, first of all, they all campaigned on a pledge to repeal the health care program. So all of these Republicans feel like they have to have this vote. There's no choice. But I would say the most amazing statistic to me in this poll is the fact that 56% of Americans polled said the bill's impact to them had not been explained well or even somewhat well.
They don't understand it.
They don't understand it. And to me, that is a monumental failure by the Obama administration because it's inconceivable that we could have spent a year and a half debating this issue and that people could still be sitting there and saying, I don't understand what it does for me. And it opens up a big hole for the Republicans, which they have driven through with, several tanks. They can say whatever they want about the health care bill, whether it's true or not. And, it will resonate. And people are afraid. People are afraid of things that they don't understand and they don't know. And the Republicans are playing to this fear, and they're doing a masterful job at it.
Okay, let's talk about the president's approval rating. Sarah, the most recent poll, I guess, is a little bit of good news for the White House comparatively. What did you find?
Well, 49% of Americans approve of the job President Obama is doing. 39% disapprove, and that's a higher approval rating at this point in his first term in office than other presidents have received. It's higher than Bill Clinton received, higher than Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter received, but at the same time it's lower than the approval rating that George W. Bush received after 2 years in office. So sort of a mixed bag. But I think one of the important things to point out is that we find much more negative assessments of the president when we ask about specific issues such as how he's handling the economy. More than half disapprove of how he's handling the deficit, and most importantly, more than half disapprove of how he's handling job creation. And that is, as I said earlier, by far the top issue on Americans' minds. So it's not good news to see a majority disapproving of the job he's doing in that area.
So are these good numbers, Ward, for the president or not?
Well, I would say the 49% is a good number, but I agree with Sarah. There's a lot of bad news in these numbers. Anytime you have a president registering disapproval above 50% in these key economic areas, that is not a good place to be. And with the 9.7, 9.8% unemployment rate, if those numbers don't come down, it's going to be big trouble for him, which is why the president is today in Schenectady, New York, meeting with Jeffrey Immelt of GE, who he's just appointed to a new council on job creation. I think the administration, it took 2 years, but they finally seem to get the message that jobs is job one.
So at the midpoint of the Obama, the first term, Sarah, comparatively, from a historical perspective, he's doing about what we would expect seen from the numbers we've seen before?
Well, he's right in the middle. He's doing better than some presidents, better than Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, who ended up being very popular after they left office, and certainly even while they were in office, but less popular than George W. Bush. I mean, it's still early days in this presidency, but he's right in the middle.
Now, also, we polled a couple of questions, I think, about Sarah Palin, because she's kind of the de facto face on the other side, or at least one of them. What did we find about the public's ratings, favorable and unfavorable, about Sarah Palin?
Views of her have generally been more unfavorable, more negative than positive. We've seen that for quite some time. There's a very specific group of Republicans and conservatives who really like her, but she holds far less appeal to Democrats and independents. But in this poll, we saw her negative ratings go up by 11 points, even higher. So more than half of Americans have a negative assessment of Sarah Palin. that movement was fairly substantial, and certainly in a negative direction.
57% unfavorable for Sarah Palin?
It's amazing to me, and yet, and I guess we're as guilty as anybody else, but the media seems to follow everything she says and everything she does. I'm not exactly certain why that is, excepting it is good copy and it does sell newspapers. But we'll have to see if that continues as her approval ratings go down and her disapproval goes up. She's in danger of marginalizing herself because of the kind of speech that she made last week in the aftermath of the uproar over the Tucson shooting. So, where she essentially portrayed herself as a victim as opposed to the people who were actually involved in the tragedy.
Now, she hasn't said one way or the other, but can she even consider a candidacy with that kind of negative number?
Well, yes and no. A very conservative candidate like her is going to do very well in Iowa. I mean, she's going to be challenged by, if Mike Huckabee runs or if this Congressman Pence runs. So, yes, she can. But, chances are you go to Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and then you start to peter out because the conservative base is not the very conservative base is not that big.
And one last thing, Sarah, before we let you go, let's talk just briefly about how the public views bipartisanship or the lack of it, or the civility question, which has been in the news. What are they saying about Republicans and Democrats?
More than 4 out of 5 Americans think that the tone and level of civility in political life is mostly negative. So it's a pretty harsh assessment there. About 3 in 4 Americans, I think it was 77%, think that President Obama is going to try to reach across the aisle and work with Republicans, but far fewer, less than half of Americans, think that the Republicans are going to reciprocate and reach across the aisle and try and work with the president.
So it looks like people are fairly frustrated.
Yeah, I think so.
If not fed up.
Yeah, I think they're frustrated and fed up. And unfortunately, I don't think anything in the next 2 years is going to alleviate that very much.
All right. Well, Sarah Dutton in New York, thanks very much. And Ward, thanks for joining us today.